The day Edna Finley rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a heart full of stubborn hope, the whole town stopped what it was doing and stared like they had never seen a woman arrive alone on the afternoon stage before. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of everything. The last real town before the Kisham Trail opened up into the raw, wind-scoured grasslands where cattlemen pushed their longhorns north and men made fortunes or broke themselves trying. The main streets smelled of horse dung and fresh-cut lumber, and the particular kind of dust that got into your teeth and stayed there for days. The saloon was loud even at 3 in the afternoon. The general store had a hand-painted sign that was already peeling, and the sheriff's office had a broken window that nobody had bothered to fix. Edna stepped off the stage and pulled her shawl tighter against the Kansas wind, squinting down the length of the street with the composed, unimpressed expression of a woman who had survived enough hardship that a rough frontier town was not going to intimidate her. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark auburn hair pinned under a modest bonnet and gray eyes the color of rain clouds over open prairie. She had a straight spine and a careful way of watching people, the kind of watchfulness that came from years of needing to read a room quickly. She had come to Caldwell because she had answered a newspaper advertisement placed by a ranch called the Rocking D, which was looking for a cook and housekeeper, and because she had no other reasonable options. Her father had died the previous winter in Wichita, leaving behind nothing but debt, a worn Bible, and a mule that turned out to belong to the bank. Her mother had passed years before that, and her one surviving brother had gone to California in 1874 and written exactly 2 letters since. Edna was not a woman who believed in sitting still and waiting for the world to improve on its own. She had answered the advertisement, received a terse but apparently genuine reply, and bought her stage ticket the following week. The reply had come from one Cornelius Donovan, owner of the Rocking D. She had imagined him as a soft-bellied, gray-templed widower, the sort of man who needed a capable woman to manage his house, because he was too occupied with cattle and ledgers to manage it himself. She had prepared herself for something practical and unemotional, a straightforward working arrangement at a respectable wage, which was all she required. What she had not prepared for was the man who came walking across the street toward the stage right at that moment, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the kind of deliberate stride that suggested he was accustomed to covering long distances on foot when his horse was otherwise occupied. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that was a little too long at the collar, and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in several days. His clothes were clean but thoroughly worn working clothes, not for display. He held his hat in his hand, which she noted as a mark in his favor. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, which was not what she had imagined at all. He stopped a few feet away and regarded her with brown eyes that were direct and serious without being unkind. There was a quiet steadiness to him, the kind that either came from good character or from being very good at hiding a bad one, and Edna had not yet determined which. "Miss Finley," he said. It was not quite a question. "Mr. Donovan," she said, also not quite a question. He nodded once as though they had reached an agreement and picked up her carpetbag before she could object. "Stage is 20 minutes late. I was starting to think you changed your mind." "I don't change my mind easily," she said, falling into step beside him. He glanced sideways at her with something that might have been amusement. "That'll be useful," he said, "or a significant inconvenience. Suppose I'll find out which." "I suppose you will," she said. They did not say much else on the walk to where his wagon was hitched, and they did not say much on the ride out to the Rocking D, which was about 7 miles southeast of town across land that got flatter and wider, and more enormous the further you went from the buildings, until the sky took up 3/4 of everything, and the grass went on in every direction like a slow green ocean. Edna watched it all with careful attention. She had grown up in eastern Kansas, where things were a little more settled, a little more crowded, and she had spent the last 2 years in Wichita, which was noisy and cramped and smelled of the stockyards. This was something different. This was space on a scale that made a person feel small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The Rocking D was a working ranch, serious and practical, without ornamentation. The main house was a 2-story frame structure, freshly whitewashed on the outside, which suggested that someone had taken some pride in it recently. There were several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a good-sized barn, and a corral where 3 horses stood in the late afternoon light looking profoundly unconcerned with anything happening in the human world. A large garden plot ran along the south side of the house, currently turned over and waiting for planting. Cornelius Donovan pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and climbed down, offering her a hand she did not strictly need, but accepted out of courtesy. "There are 2 ranch hands who sleep in the bunkhouse," he said, carrying her bag up the porch steps. "Tom Briggs and his younger brother, Will. Good workers, both of them. They eat with us most evenings. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Hanratty, who can vouch for my character if you feel the need. I want to be straightforward with you. The advertisement was honest. I need someone who can manage the house and cook the meals. In return, you get a fair wage, your own room, and decent treatment. I'm not a difficult man to work for." He said all of this in the same level, serious tone, looking at her directly, and Edna found herself believing him. She had spent enough time around men who were difficult to work for to recognize one, and there was nothing in Cornelius Donovan that rang any of those familiar warning bells. He seemed, in fact, simply straightforward, which was a quality she had not encountered in a man for quite some time, and which she appreciated more than she could reasonably say on a first acquaintance. "That seems entirely fair," she said. "I'll hold you to every word of it." The corners of his mouth moved. "I expect you will," he said, and opened the front door. The inside of the house was what it was: functional, clean enough, a little sparse, with the particular quality of a space that had once been cared for, and had since been maintained by someone who knew how to keep things from falling apart, but did not know how to make them warm. There were curtains on the windows, but they were plain and colorless. The furniture was solid and good. The kitchen had a well-maintained cast iron stove, a good work table, and a pantry that was adequately but not generously stocked. There were no flowers anywhere. There was no decoration of any kind beyond a small framed photograph on the mantel that Edna did not look at directly because it was not her business yet. She unpacked her bag in the small upstairs bedroom that he showed her and took stock of things. The mattress was new. The washstand had a clean pitcher and basin. The window looked out over the back of the property, past the garden to a gentle rise of land where a few cottonwood trees stood in a cluster, their leaves just beginning to come in, pale and soft in the evening light. It was not the worst place she had ever lived. It was, in fact, probably one of the better ones. She came downstairs and made supper from what was in the pantry: salt pork, cornbread, beans cooked with a little dried chili, and the last of some preserved peaches that were still good. And when Tom and Will Briggs came in from the barn, stomping their boots on the porch and pulling off their hats, the look on their faces when they sat down to the table told her everything she needed to know about what they had been eating before she arrived. Tom was somewhere around 30, weathered and amiable, with an easy grin and the kind of hands that had been doing hard work since boyhood. Will was younger, perhaps 20 or 21, quieter and more watchful, with the same coloring as his brother but a less certain manner, as though he was still deciding what kind of man he intended to be. Cornelius Donovan sat at the head of the table and ate with the focused attention of a man who had not eaten well in some time, though he was too dignified to comment on it. When he was done, he looked up and said, "That was very good, Miss Finley," with a gravity that made it sound like a considered judgment rather than a polite remark. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," she said, and began clearing the plates. This was how it began. In the days that followed, Edna established herself in the rhythms of the Rocking D, with the efficiency of a woman who had always had to make herself useful quickly. She reorganized the kitchen, took an inventory of the supplies, and wrote a careful list of what was needed in town, planted the garden with seeds she had brought in her bag and additional ones she bartered for from a neighboring ranch woman named Clara Pace, who rode over on a dun horse one morning and spent 3 hours talking over the fence with a forthright warmth that Edna found immediately restorative. "How are you finding it?" Clara asked, leaning her arms on the top rail of the garden fence with the relaxed posture of a woman who had been comfortable outdoors her entire life. "Fine so far," Edna said, tamping soil around a row of bean seeds. "The work is reasonable, the men are respectful, and Mr. Donovan," Edna sat back on her heels and gave Clara a measured look, "also respectful," she said. Clara's expression was the carefully neutral one of a woman who had a great deal more to say on the subject and was exercising restraint. "He's a good man," she said finally. "He's had a harder time of it than he shows. His wife passed, nearly 4 years ago now. Fever. They'd only been married 2 years. He took it very hard and mostly just poured himself into the ranch after." Edna said nothing because nothing seemed appropriate. She looked at the row of seeds she had just planted and thought about the photograph on the mantel, which she still had not looked at directly. "I'm not suggesting anything," Clara said, reading her silence accurately. "I'm only telling you so you understand the house a little better." "I appreciate it," Edna said, and meant it. She thought about it in the evenings, when the work was done, and the house was quiet and Cornelius was in his study going over the ranch books or reading by the lamp, and she sat at the kitchen table with her mending or her own reading. She thought about it in the way you think about something you are trying not to think about, which is to say it kept coming back regardless. He was not what she had expected, but she was beginning to think that was simply because she had expected the wrong thing. He was a man of few words, but the words he chose were considered and honest. He was capable and thorough in his work, and she noticed, as one notices things that one is paying more attention to than is strictly professional, that he was fair in the way he dealt with Tom and Will, firm without being harsh, and generous with his praise when they had done something well. He had a particular way of listening when someone spoke to him, a quality of full attention that made you feel that what you were saying was being genuinely received, which was rarer than it ought to be. He also had a sense of humor that was so dry it sometimes took Edna a full minute to realize he had made a joke, and when she did she found herself smiling in spite of herself. The first real conversation they had, not transactional, not practical, a genuine conversation, happened about 3 weeks after she arrived, on a Sunday afternoon when the Briggs brothers had gone to town and the ranch was quiet. She was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching a hawk circle over the south pasture in the blue and enormous sky, and Cornelius came out and stood at the rail with his own cup and looked at the same hawk. "My father used to say that watching a hawk work is the best argument for patience that nature ever made," he said after a long and companionable silence. "Your father was right," Edna said. "Where was he from?" "County Cork," Cornelius said. "Came over in the famine years, 1848. He was 17 years old and he spoke almost no English, and he had a brother who died on the crossing. He never talked about it much." "My father's family came from Pennsylvania, originally," Edna said. "His grandfather was a farmer there, came west with one of the early wagon parties in 1830. My father said his grandfather told him the land was so open it frightened him at first. He said a man could go mad trying to find the edges of it." Cornelius turned to look at her then, with an expression she could not entirely categorize, interested, and something else underneath that. "Did your father love Kansas?" he asked. "He learned to," she said. "He said loving it was like making peace with a difficult thing. You had to decide to do it." Cornelius turned back to look at the hawk. "That's an accurate description of several things," he said. They stayed on the porch for another hour, talking about their fathers and about Kansas, and about the changes coming. The railroad pressing further west, the ranges filling up, the trail drives that would eventually be pushed out by fences and farms. He talked about it with a practical acceptance that was not resignation, a sense that the world moved and you moved with it, and the important thing was to hold on to what was worth holding. Edna found herself talking more than she had talked to anyone in months, and the ease of it surprised her. When she went inside to start supper, she stood in the kitchen for a moment before lighting the stove and told herself, quite firmly and sensibly, that she was here to do a job, and that whatever warm and inconvenient thing was quietly growing in her chest was not something she was going to encourage. She was not, as it turned out, as successful at this as she would have liked. Trouble came to Caldwell in the form of a man named Driscoll Hart, which was a name that sounded made up, which did not prevent it from being attached to a very real and very unpleasant person. Hart ran a loose operation of cattle trading that was widely understood to include a significant amount of cattle that had not precisely been purchased, and he had been acquiring land in the area, some of it through legitimate purchase, and some of it through the kind of pressure that walked right up to the edge of legal without quite crossing it. He had made offers on the Rocking D twice in the past year, both times through an intermediary and both times for figures that were insultingly below what the ranch was worth. Cornelius had declined both times without ceremony. Edna found this out not from Cornelius but from Clara Pace, who arrived one morning in May with a jar of honey and a face full of concern, and told her that Hart had approached a third time, this time directly, and that there had been an unpleasant scene in the street in front of the general store where Hart had made some remarks that were not, strictly speaking, a threat but had been clearly intended to be understood as one. He said something to the effect that it was unfortunate when a man worked hard on something only to lose it to bad luck, Clara said, with the careful diction of a person quoting words they found repellent. And Mr. Donovan told him that he had been fortunate so far in that his luck had been consistently good, and then he turned around and went into the store. What did Hart do? Edna asked. Stood there looking like he'd bitten into something sour, Clara said. Then he left. But Edna, he's not a man who accepts that sort of answer gracefully. He's been known to make things difficult for people who won't sell. That evening, Edna watched Cornelius eat his supper with the same unhurried composure he always had, talking with Tom and Will about the cattle and the spring grass and a fence line on the north pasture that needed repair, and she felt something tighten in her chest that was not fear for herself but something adjacent to it. After supper, when the Briggs brothers had gone to the bunkhouse, she stood at the sink washing up and said, without turning around, "Clara Pace told me about Driscoll Hart." There was a pause. She heard Cornelius set his coffee cup down on the table. "Clara is a good woman, but she worries," he said. "Clara is a sensible woman, and so do I," Edna said, turning around. "Is it a real concern?" He looked at her for a moment with that full, considering attention of his. "It's a real nuisance," he said. "Whether it becomes a real concern depends on how much Hart is willing to push. I don't intend to sell the ranch." "I didn't suppose you did," she said. "I only want to understand the situation." "Why?" he asked, and there was something genuine and a little careful in the question, as though her answer mattered. She held his gaze. "Because I live here," she said, and then, more quietly, "and because it matters to me how things go for this place." He was quiet for a moment. The lamplight was warm and steady, and outside the night wind was moving through the cottonwoods with a soft, rushing sound. "Thank you," he said, and he said it simply, without awkwardness, like a man who had not been thanked in a long time and recognized the thing for what it was. "I'll tell you if it becomes something to worry about." "You do that," she said, and turned back to the dishes. Things grew, quietly, in the way that things grow when you are not quite watching them, by increments so small that each one is deniable, but the accumulation of which becomes undeniable. He started coming into the kitchen in the mornings earlier than he needed to, before the Briggs brothers were up, and they would have coffee together in the blue pre-dawn quiet before the day started. And this became, without either of them remarking on it, a thing that they both expected, and that made the day feel differently when it happened, and differently when it didn't. She started leaving a slice of pie or cake or bread on his desk in the study in the evenings, not because it was part of her duties, but because she had noticed he forgot to eat when he was working in there, and it seemed foolish not to address a problem she was in a position to address. He always ate it and never mentioned it except once, when she had made a particular apple cake from a recipe her mother had used, and he had come out of the study and found her still sitting at the kitchen table and said, "I don't know what you put in that cake, but it tastes like something I remember from a long time ago," with a look on his face that she was not going to examine too closely right now. "Thank you." They had a disagreement in June over whether to hire a third ranch hand for the summer. She thought yes. The workload was clearly beyond what two men could handle efficiently. He thought the expense was premature, and they argued about it in the kitchen with an energy and directness that left them both slightly flushed and surprised at themselves. And then he hired the ranch hand the following week, a steady older man named Pete Albrecht, and did not make a production of it, and she did not make a production of him doing it. The photograph on the mantel turned out to be his wife, whose name had been Rose. He told her this himself, one evening in late June when she had finally worked up the nerve to ask carefully about the picture. He talked about Rose for about 10 minutes, not with grief that was still raw but with the gentler, settled kind of sadness that comes after grief has done most of its work. Rose had been from Missouri, had loved horses, had laughed very easily and often. He talked about her with love, and with the particular tenderness of a man who has had time to understand that loving someone who is gone does not prevent him from still living. Edna listened and said almost nothing and thought about how much she respected him for the way he carried that loss, not hidden away and not performed, just carried honestly as part of who he was. She thought about her own losses too, that night in her room. Her mother at 17, her father last winter, the particular loneliness of being 26 and having survived more than you had built. She lay in her bed and listened to the wind and thought about the way Cornelius had looked at her across the kitchen table when he said, "Thank you," that evening in May, and she told herself very clearly and with complete conviction that she was being completely ridiculous. The situation with Driscoll Hart moved from nuisance to real trouble on a Thursday afternoon in early July, when one of the Rocking D's fence lines on the western boundary was found cut, 3 sections of it, clean wire cuts that were not the work of strays or weather. The following week, 2 of the Rocking D's young steers were found dead in a gulch about a mile from the boundary, and the veterinarian from Caldwell who came to look said that they had been shot, though from a distance and with nothing that could be traced directly. Cornelius rode into town and spoke to the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Aldrich who had the distracted air of someone managing a job that was more complicated than he had expected and not entirely sure what to do about it. Aldrich said he would look into it, in the tone of a man who intended to look into it the way you look into a dark cellar from the top of the stairs briefly, and with no intention of going further. Cornelius came home from that conversation looking, for the first time since Edna had known him, genuinely troubled. Not afraid, exactly, but carrying a weight that showed in the set of his jaw and the stillness around his eyes. She had supper on the table when he came in, and she waited until the Briggs brothers and Pete Albrecht had finished and gone out before she said, "Tell me what Aldrich said." He told her. He told her all of it, including the part he had not told the Briggs brothers, which was that he had it on reliable information from a man in town that Hart had recently brought in 2 hired hands who were not ranch workers in any conventional sense, men who had been associated with some ugliness in Dodge City the previous year, the kind of ugliness that involved threatening people's livelihoods in systematic ways until they sold. "So he's done this before," Edna said. "Apparently," Cornelius said. "And Aldrich is not going to help." Cornelius looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "Aldrich is a man who weighs his interests carefully," he said, which was a diplomatic description of a man who was not going to put himself in Hart's way for the sake of anyone else. "Then we need to think about what we can do ourselves," Edna said. The "we" came out naturally, without forethought, and they both heard it. Cornelius looked at her with an expression that was complicated and quiet, and that she was quite sure she was reading correctly, but could not do anything about right now because there was a practical problem in front of them. "I appreciate that," he said after a moment. "But I don't want you in the middle of something that could get dangerous." "I am already in the middle of it," Edna said with patience and precision. "I live here. What happens to this ranch affects me. I am not asking your permission to be concerned about it, Mr. Donovan. I'm telling you that I intend to be useful, so you might as well tell me what I can do." He stared at her for what felt like a significant amount of time. "You are, without any question," he said, "the most relentlessly practical woman I have ever met in my life." "Thank you," she said. "What can I do?" What she did, as it turned out, was write a letter. She wrote a very careful, very detailed letter to a land agent in Wichita whom she had encountered during her time there. A man named Fielding who had a reputation for honesty in a profession where that was unusual. And in the letter she laid out everything she knew about Hart's pattern of behavior. The offers, the pressure, the fence cuts, the dead cattle, and she asked whether there were legal remedies that Cornelius might not be aware of, and whether a formal complaint to the territorial authorities rather than the local sheriff might produce better results. Fielding's reply came in 10 days. It was 3 pages long and extremely useful. It turned out that Hart had a land dispute on record in 2 other Kansas counties, and that there was a territorial land agent named Morrison who had been quietly building a case against him, and would be very interested to hear from anyone with additional evidence of his practices. Fielding included Morrison's address in Topeka. Edna brought the letter to Cornelius in the study on a Tuesday evening. She knocked, which she always did, and he told her to come in, and she set the letter on the desk in front of him and stood back while he read it. She watched his face as he read. It went from the careful neutral it usually wore to something that opened very slightly, like a window being raised an inch to let in air. When he finished, he put the letter down and looked up at her, and for a moment said nothing at all. "How did you know to write to Fielding?" he asked finally. "I worked in the land registry office in Wichita for 8 months, she said. "I learned things." "You worked in a land registry office," he said, as though adding this piece to a picture he was assembling. "I've done a great number of things," she said. "I came here as a housekeeper because it was the best of my current options. I am still a housekeeper, but I also wrote the letter." He looked at her for another of those long, full moments, and then he said, "Edna," and stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both heard that too. "Write to Morrison," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Do it this week." He wrote to Morrison the following morning. Morrison's response came 3 weeks later and contained the information that he was, in fact, conducting an official investigation and that the evidence from the rocking D was valuable. He advised Cornelius to document everything carefully going forward and to bring any future incidents to him directly, bypassing Aldrich entirely. Hart's men cut the fence line again in August, and Cornelius documented it with written records, dates, and measurements, and sent the documentation to Morrison by the next stage. 2 weeks after that, there was an official notice delivered to Driscoll Hart from the Territorial Land Authority in Topeka, which was, as Clara Pace reported with satisfaction when she rode over to tell Edna about it, the most useful piece of paper anyone had received in Caldwell County in living memory. It was the beginning of a process that would take several more months, but that was clearly, finally, moving in the right direction. What this meant for Hart's immediate behavior was that he pulled back, temporarily but noticeably. The fence line stayed intact. The cattle were undisturbed. The unpleasant intermediaries disappeared from the local saloon. The ranch breathed again. On the Sunday after the territorial notice was delivered, Cornelius came into the kitchen in the morning and found Edna already there, making a proper breakfast with eggs and biscuits and thick-cut bacon, the whole kitchen warm and smelling of coffee and something sweet. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her with an expression she had been carefully not acknowledging for 2 months now, and she looked back at him, and the careful not acknowledging became suddenly, quietly unsustainable. "Edna," he said again. "Cornelius," she said back, which was also the first time she had used his given name, and she saw what it did to him, that small word, her voice saying it, and she felt something in her chest unlock that had been locked for a very long time. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and stopped just in front of her, and she looked up at him. He was a full head taller, and he raised one hand and touched her face with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible in hands that were roughened and strong, just the backs of his fingers along her cheekbone, barely touching. "I don't want to presume," he said quietly, and the care in it was so complete that she felt it like a physical thing. "You are not presuming," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. He looked at her for another moment with those honest brown eyes that did not know how to hide anything important, and then he leaned down and kissed her, softly and carefully, as though she were something he was still learning the reality of. She kissed him back with the full conviction of a woman who had thought about this more than she was going to admit, and had decided, now that it was happening, that she had no intention whatsoever of being ambivalent about it. When they separated, they were both very quiet for a moment, the kitchen around them full of the smell of biscuits that needed to come out of the oven, the early morning light coming in yellow and warm through the window. "The biscuits," she said. "Right," he said, and stepped back, and she moved to the oven, and they did not say anything more for several minutes, but the silence between them was entirely different from any silence they had shared before. Tom Briggs, who came in for breakfast 20 minutes later, looked from one to the other of them with the bright, comprehending expression of a man who had been waiting for something, and was pleased to see it finally arrive, but was wise enough not to say anything about it out loud. Will Briggs, who came in 3 minutes after Tom, did not notice anything at all, which was about what you expected from Will. What followed was a courtship conducted, as most things in Edna and Cornelius's relationship were conducted, with practicality and directness, and a great deal of genuine warmth underneath both of those qualities. He asked her one evening, about a week after the morning in the kitchen, whether she would like to ride out with him to see the northern edge of the property, where there was a particularly good view across the valley at sunset, and she said yes with the composure of a woman who had been hoping to be asked. They rode out together in the late afternoon on a pair of good horses, hers a steady bay mare named Caroline, whom she had already come to love, and they stood on the northern ridge in the evening light with the whole valley spread out below them, the grass turning gold in the low sun, and the creek catching the light in bright flashes further down, and the sky going every shade from blue to bronze at once. "I want to tell you something," he said, standing beside her with his hat in his hands in the way he always held it when he was being most direct with her. "Tell me," she said. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I was looking for someone to cook and keep the house. That was the honest truth of it. I was not looking for anything else, and I want you to know that I did not bring you here under any false pretenses." "I know that," she said. "But I also want you to know," he said, and he paused in the way he paused when he was finding the most accurate words, "that whatever this is, what's happened between us, it's the most significant thing that has happened to me in a very long time, and I am not a man who uses words like that without meaning them." She looked at him in the warm evening light, at the honest face she had been reading for 4 months now, and understood better than she had understood most things in her life. "I believe you," she said. "And I feel the same. I want you to know that I am also not a woman who says that carelessly." He looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, as close to happy as she had seen on him. He reached out and took her hand, which fit in his in the particular way that some hands fit together, and they stood there on the ridge until the sun was all the way down and the first stars were coming out, and the valley below them was deep blue in the dusk. He asked her to marry him on a Wednesday afternoon in September, which was perhaps not the most expected timing, but Cornelius was not a man who performed gestures for the sake of convention. He had been thinking about it since August. She could tell there was something in the way he had been looking at her, a consideration, a weighing. And on that Wednesday afternoon he came in from checking the south pasture, still dusty from the ride, and found her in the kitchen putting up preserves. And he leaned against the doorframe and said, "Edna, I would like very much to marry you if you'll have me," with the same direct, honest gravity he brought to every important thing he said. She put down the jar she was holding and turned to look at him, and the smile that came across her face was not the controlled, careful kind she usually managed, but the other kind, the real one, the one that surprised even her with how completely it took over. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands and kissed her properly and at length, and the preserves sat unattended on the stove, and neither of them cared even slightly. They were married in Caldwell on a Saturday in October, in the small church that had been built the previous year, in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend, and attended by Clara and her husband Daniel Pace, Tom and Will Briggs, Pete Albrecht, fielding the land agent who had ridden up from Wichita at Edna's invitation, and a considerable portion of Caldwell who had heard about the wedding, and arrived on their own initiative, because any occasion was a welcome occasion in a town that had few enough of them. Clara had brought flowers from her own garden, the last of the season, autumn asters in purple and white that Edna carried in a bunch with a blue ribbon tied around them. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the 2 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, working on it in the evenings while Cornelius sat nearby reading, and occasionally looking up at her, with an expression that she was now free to recognize and return. He was waiting for her at the front of the church with Tom Briggs beside him, and when she came through the door on her own arm, there being no father left to give her, a fact she had accepted with the same practical acknowledgment she gave most losses, and walked toward him down the aisle and saw his face, she understood that she was looking at a man who understood exactly what was happening to him and was completely, wholeheartedly glad of it. The Reverend said the words and they said the words back, and when it was over and he kissed her in front of the whole town and someone in the back whooped, which caused a ripple of laughter that warmed the little church to its rafters, Edna felt something settle in her that she had not realized was still looking for a place to land. After the ceremony, there was a gathering back at the rocking D that turned into something resembling a genuine celebration, with a fiddle player Clara had somehow produced, and a great deal of food that the neighboring ranch women had contributed in the communal way of frontier communities that understood that occasions were rare and should be honored properly. The bunkhouse was decorated with dried flowers. Someone brought a jug of good whiskey. Tom Briggs danced with considerable enthusiasm and no particular skill and was cheered for both. Will Briggs danced once with a girl from town he had been working up the nerve to approach for months and looked as though he might not survive the experience. Cornelius danced with Edna twice, moving with the careful precision of a man who had learned to dance in the way that men who are not naturally inclined toward dancing learn, by practice and determination rather than instinct, and she followed him easily, and felt the pleasure of being in his arms in a formal context after months of being in his arms in a private one. "Are you happy?" he said quietly, as they moved across the swept boards of the kitchen floor while someone had pushed the tables back. She looked up at him. "Exceedingly," she said. "Are you?" "More than I thought I would be this time last year," he said, with the honest, quiet directness that she had loved in him from fairly early on, whether she had been prepared to call it love at the time or not. "That's the best kind of happy," she said. He tightened his hand around hers and they turned in the lamplight, and the fiddler played something that went on, and the night was warm for October, and the stars outside were brilliant over the Kansas grass. The months that followed the wedding were the kind that build a life in the deep sense, the way that foundation stones are laid, not spectacular, but load-bearing. Edna took on the role of ranch wife with the same organized intelligence she had brought to every other role she had occupied, which meant that within 6 months the Rocking D's accounts were in better order than they had ever been. The household was running with a quiet, effective smoothness. The garden was producing enough that she was preserving and selling the surplus, and she had identified 2 inefficiencies in the way the cattle operation was managed that, once she raised them carefully with Cornelius and let him think about them for a few days, he agreed to address. He did not find it threatening, a woman who was this competent and opinionated. That was one of the things she had learned about him that she loved most. He received her ideas with the same open attention he received everything, weighed them honestly, and adopted the good ones without making a performance of it either way. He disagreed with her sometimes and told her so plainly, and she disagreed right back, and they worked things out between them with a directness that neither of them had to moderate for the other's ego, which was extraordinary. They had evenings by the fire in the parlor, after the work was done and the rest of the house was quiet, where they talked about everything, books they had read, things they remembered about the people they had loved and lost, the country and what was happening to it, the future of the ranch. He told her more about his father's journey from Ireland, and she told him more about growing up in eastern Kansas before the trails came through and changed everything. She told him about the 2 years in Wichita and the particular loneliness of a city that moved fast and cared about nobody. He told her about the years immediately after Rose, which he had never talked about with anyone before, the emptiness and the way work had been both a rescue and a postponement. He was not a demonstrative man in public. Too much of his interior life was conducted in that considered quiet. But he was tender with her in private, tender and attentive and occasionally surprising in a way that still caught her off guard, which she enjoyed more than she would have admitted to anyone else. There was a morning in December when she came downstairs and found a small object on the kitchen table next to her coffee cup. A piece of petrified wood he had found while riding the north pasture, smooth and warm-colored, shot through with veins of rust and gold. No note, no explanation. Just the stone where she would find it because he had seen it and thought she would like it, and he was right. The territorial investigation into Driscoll Hart concluded in March of 1879, with a formal finding of fraudulent land practices across 3 counties, resulting in Hart being fined substantially and several of his land acquisitions being reversed or put under review. He left Caldwell that spring and was reportedly seen in Colorado, which was far enough away to be someone else's problem. The Rocking D was safe, definitively, and Cornelius stood on the porch the morning after he received Morrison's final letter, and breathed the April air with a deliberateness that told Edna exactly how much of his mental weight had been occupied by that threat for longer than he had let on. She came out and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking down, and she leaned into it. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. The spring of 1879 brought cattle north up the Kishom Trail again, and with them the renewed business of a trail town. Caldwell was growing new businesses, new families, the railroad extension that everyone had been discussing for 2 years, actually beginning to look like a real possibility rather than a rumor. The Rocking D expanded too. Cornelius bought the adjacent parcel to the east when it came available, 300 acres of good grazing land that doubled the ranch's effective range, and he and Tom and Pete and a newly hired 4th hand spent most of June riding fence lines and negotiating with cattle agents in town for the new season's drives. Well, Briggs married the girl from town he had danced with at the wedding reception, whose name was Ada, and there was another occasion for a celebration, this one at the Briggs' newly built small house at the edge of town, and Edna and Cornelius went and danced and drank good punch and watched Will's transforming happiness with the pleasure that people who have found each other tend to feel when they see it happening to someone else. "He looks exactly like a man who cannot quite believe his luck," Cornelius said. "Watching will lead Ada across the floor with the careful, devoted attention of a young man who has decided that dancing matters now and is going to master it." "He does," Edna said. "It's wonderful." Cornelius looked down at her with a warmth that she no longer had any need to catalogue or deny. "Does he look familiar?" he asked. She laughed, which was the right answer. In July of 1879, Edna told Cornelius that she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the early morning, in the established tradition of their most important conversations, with coffee in hand and the light coming up slowly over the eastern grass, turning everything from gray to gold. He went very still for a moment, in the way he went still when something mattered completely, and then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before, not the steady consideration that was his usual manner, not the quiet warmth that she had come to know as love, but something more naked and more overwhelming than both. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he could make himself say. "Very well," she said. "Healthy and well." He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail very carefully and put both arms around her and held her with a tenderness so fierce that she felt it all through her, and she put her hands against his chest and closed her eyes and let herself be held. "I don't have the words for this," he said, against her hair. "You don't need them," she said. Clara Pace came to help, as Clara came to help with everything, and the ranch adjusted around the pregnancy with the practicality of a household that had reorganized itself for challenges before. Tom Briggs took on additional tasks without being asked. Pete Albrecht learned to bake cornbread with a dogged determination that produced mixed but earnest results. Cornelius arrived home from the range earlier in the evenings without making any announcement about it, and on the nights when she was tired or unwell, he sat beside her in the parlor and read aloud from whatever book she chose, his voice steady and unhurried, until she fell asleep. The winter of 1879 was hard, a succession of cold fronts that drove ice and snow across the Kansas plains, with the efficient brutality that Kansas winters deploy without apology. But the ranch was prepared, and the house was warm, and in March of 1880, in the bedroom where Edna had slept alone in her first weeks at the Rocking D, she gave birth to a son. Cornelius was in the house, because nothing short of a catastrophe would have moved him elsewhere, and Clara was there to help, and the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Calloway, who had considerable experience in these matters. It was a long night and a hard one, the kind that reminds you that life announces itself at full volume, and when it was over and the baby was breathing and Edna was pale and exhausted but perfectly fine, Clara came to the door of the room and told Cornelius he could come in. He came in and looked at Edna, and then at the bundle in her arms, and he sat down on the edge of the bed very carefully and looked at his son with an expression that was, simply, wonder. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes and was remarkably loud for something of his size. "What do we call him?" Cornelius asked. Edna looked down at the baby, then at her husband. "James," she said. "After your father." Cornelius said nothing for a moment. His father's name had been James Donovan, who had come from County Cork at 17 with nothing, and had made a life from the whole cloth of hard work and stubbornness, and the belief that the next piece of ground would be better. Cornelius looked at his son with the name settling around him and felt the past and the present connect in the way they sometimes do, suddenly and with great force. "James," he said. "Yes." James Donovan grew from a loud, emphatic baby into a loud, emphatic toddler with his mother's gray eyes, and his father's absolute determination to understand how everything worked before accepting any conclusions about it. He was in the barn before he was 2, reaching for the horses with unfrightened hands. He was asking questions before his sentences were entirely coherent, and the questions did not stop when the sentences caught up. Tom Briggs took to him immediately and carried him on his shoulders around the ranch with the pleased ease of a man who is very comfortable with children. Pete Albrecht taught him to feed the chickens and showed him, at age 3, how to scatter the grain in a circle rather than a pile, so the chickens did not crowd each other. Cornelius carried James on the saddle in front of him when he rode the pasture lines. The boy's small face turned into the wind with an expression of pure satisfaction, and Edna watched them go from the porch and felt something settle in her heart with such completeness that she had to stop and acknowledge it deliberately. This was the life she had built, had walked into on a stagecoach with a carpetbag and a derringer and a refusal to stop hoping, and it was more than she had hoped for. The rocking D continued to grow and to thrive. The railroad reached Caldwell in 1880, which changed the cattle trade considerably. The drives were shorter, the prices better, the logistics cleaner, and Cornelius navigated the transition with the practical intelligence he brought to everything, adapting the ranch's operations to take advantage of the new market structure. He sold cattle that year at a price that made Tom Briggs, who had been there from the beginning, shake his head in satisfied disbelief. The Territorial Land Authority's action against Hart had ultimately resulted in the release of several land parcels that Hart had pressured farmers and small ranchers into selling under duress. Two of those farmers came to the Rocking D in the fall of 1880 to thank Cornelius for being the one to provide documentation to Morrison, because the Rocking D's records had apparently been the most complete and compelling in the file. Cornelius told them it had not only been him, and when they looked curious about that, he said simply, "My wife had the right contacts and knew what to document," which was entirely accurate, and which Edna, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, heard and felt warm about for the rest of the day. She had made herself a place in Caldwell that went beyond the Rocking D. She was on the committee that organized the school building's construction. Caldwell's growing population finally warranted a real schoolhouse rather than lessons in the Reverend's front parlor, and she contributed materially to it, both in money and in the kind of organized, practical energy that gets things built when everything else is equal. She knew every ranch wife within 20 miles, had attended every birth that Clara could not handle alone, and had an ongoing correspondence with Fielding in Wichita that kept her informed about land law and territorial politics in a way that was periodically useful. She did not think of this as remarkable. She thought of it as being a person in a place, which was what you did. Clara Pace noticed and commented on it with characteristic directness. "You landed here with one bag and you've become the backbone of half this county inside 2 years." "That's an exaggeration," Edna said. "It's not by much," Clara said. "Honestly, Edna, you're remarkable." "I'm practical," Edna said. "Some people would say those are the same thing," Clara said. Cornelius said something similar once in his more understated way. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, James asleep inside, the warm night full of cricket sound and the distant low voices of Tom and Pete in the bunkhouse, and he had been looking at her in that particular way he had, the full attending way, for a while before he spoke. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I think about the afternoon you got off that stage," he said. "You had that carpetbag and that very particular expression, like you were deciding whether the place was worth your time. And I remember thinking, this is a woman who does not make things easy, and I wasn't sure yet whether I meant that as a worry or a recommendation." She smiled. "Which was it?" "The finest recommendation I ever encountered," he said, without hesitation. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. And they sat that way while the stars came out over the Kansas grass, which went on in every direction as far as you could possibly see, enormous and quiet, and full of whatever future you were willing to build in it. The following spring brought new calves and warm weather and a letter from Edna's brother in California, the first in several years, which was unexpected and complicated. His name was Richard, and he wrote to say that he was coming east, that things in California had not worked out as he had hoped, and that he was making his way back toward Kansas and would appreciate knowing whether he might stop at the Rocking D. Edna read the letter twice, and then put it down and thought about Richard, who was 2 years younger than her and had always been the one who went away, who let things go, who relied on the assumption that someone else would manage. She had not been angry about it exactly, but she had been aware of a kind of loneliness in the years after their father died that had partly to do with being the only one there. "He can come," she said to Cornelius, who had waited with her while she read the letter and was waiting still. "He's family, but I am going to be honest with him." "That sounds right," Cornelius said, which was exactly the response she had expected. Richard arrived in June of 1881, thinner than she remembered him and quieter, with the particular self-conscious quality of a man who has been humbled by events and is not entirely sure how to present himself in the aftermath. He was 24 and looked older. He held his hat in both hands when he met Cornelius on the porch and said, "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Donovan," in the sincere, careful way of a man who is aware he has not always earned the hospitality of those he loves. Cornelius looked at him with the considering attention he gave to everyone he met for the first time and then said, "Call me Cornelius. We're going to put you to work if you stay any length of time, so there's no need for formality." Richard looked somewhat relieved. "I can work," he said. "Good," Cornelius said. Edna had her honest conversation with Richard that evening, after supper, sitting on the porch just the two of them while James slept and Cornelius gave them time. She told Richard that she was glad he had come and that she loved him and that she had felt his absence in the hard years. She said it plainly and without cruelty, and he listened and said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "I know, Edna. I know I wasn't there. I don't have a reason that makes it right." "I'm not asking you to explain it," she said. "I'm asking you to stay, or at least to not just go again because staying gets hard." He looked at her with the gray eyes they had both inherited from their mother. "I'll stay," he said. "I mean it." He did mean it. He stayed through the summer, working alongside Tom and Pete, and the new hands that the expanded ranch required, learning cattle work with a willingness that was partly penance and partly genuine discovery that he was suited to it. He had their mother's coordination and their father's stubbornness, and by July he was pulling his weight without question. He was good with James, who adored him immediately in the unreserved way of small children who sense uncomplicated affection. By fall, Richard had a place at the Rocking D that was real, not temporary. He saved enough from his wages to build a small addition to the bunkhouse that was properly his own, and he wrote a letter to a woman in Wichita whom he had known before California, a woman named Helen, and whatever was in that letter she replied, and they began a correspondence that Will Briggs noticed and teased him about relentlessly, and that Richard endured with the good-natured patience of a man who knows the teasing is completely warranted. Edna watched her brother finding his footing, and felt the last residual loneliness she had been carrying without fully acknowledging dissolve into the ordinary warmth of the life around her. She was expecting their second child by the autumn of 1881, and this time she told Cornelius in the kitchen, early in the morning in their established tradition, but she had baked a small cake and set it on the table because she felt the occasion warranted something other than just words. He saw the cake and looked at her and understood before she said anything. "Again," he said, and the warmth in it was enormous. "Again," she said. He came around the table and took her hands and held them and looked at her with that expression she had seen first when James was born, the wonder, the full-body gladness, and said, "I'll never be able to tell you what this is. Either time. Both times." "I know," she said. "I feel it too." Their second child was born in April of 1882, a girl this time, who arrived in the early morning with slightly less drama than James had managed, but with no less determination to announce her presence. They named her Margaret, after Cornelius's mother, and she had auburn hair like Edna and her father's brown eyes, and the focused, considering quality of both her parents condensed into something very small and very loud. James, who was 2 and very firmly in possession of his own opinions, regarded Margaret with initial suspicion, and then, within about a week, with the protective devotion that would characterize his relationship with his sister for the rest of their childhoods and beyond. He brought her things. He sat near her with the solemnity of a small ambassador on important business. He told Pete Albrecht one morning with great seriousness that Margaret was his sister and she was very good. Pete Albrecht said, "She sure is," with the gravity appropriate to the announcement. The Rocking D in the summer of 1882 was a different place from the struggling, quiet ranch that Edna had stepped off the stage to find 4 years earlier. The house had been extended, a proper parlor that was not also a working room, another bedroom for the children, a good porch across the whole front of the house that caught the afternoon light beautifully, and where the family spent their evenings in the warm months. The garden was productive and well organized, and supplied not only the household but several others in the vicinity. The barn was full and the pastures were healthy, and the operation ran with an efficiency that people in the county noticed and occasionally mentioned to Cornelius in the way of sincere compliments. He was different, too, in the ways that years of being genuinely happy make a person different. Not softer exactly, he was still the same deliberate, serious man, but fuller somehow, more present. The quietness that had been about loss had been replaced by something else, a quietness that was about contentment. He was not a man who talked about himself much, but he did not need to. It was in the way he moved through the ranch, the way he called his children's names from the porch, the way he looked at Edna across the dinner table in the evenings when the house was full and bright and loud and alive. There was one evening in September, after the children were in bed and Richard had gone to the bunkhouse and Tom and Pete had gone home to their respective lives, and the house was quiet around them the way it got sometimes, not empty quiet, but settled quiet, the quiet of something that is fully itself. And Cornelius had brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch and given her one, and they had been sitting there for a while in the company of the stars and the cattle sounds and the cottonwood trees and the enormous Kansas night. And he said, "I want to tell you something I have been meaning to say for a while." "Tell me," she said. "I would not have known to want this," he said. "The way it is now, I would not have known to ask for it or to believe it was possible. What I had in mind 4 years ago when I placed that advertisement, what I had in mind was something manageable, something that would get the work done and not hurt. I did not have in mind this." He paused, looking out at the grass and the sky. "What you brought here, what you made of this place and of me. I want you to know that I know what it is and that I don't take any part of it for granted." Edna held her coffee cup in both hands and let the words settle into her and looked at this man she had married, who was careful with language the way a craftsman is careful with tools, and who therefore never wasted words on things he did not mean. "Cornelius," she said, "when I got off that stage with that carpetbag and no reasonable plan beyond taking the next thing in front of me, I was not unhappy exactly, but I was very alone. And I had gotten used to alone the way you get used to something that is not what you want, but is what you have. And then I sat down at your kitchen table and you said, 'That was very good,' about my cooking, with that face like you had actually tasted something real for the first time in ages. And I thought, this man is honest. Whatever else he is or isn't, he is honest. And in my experience that is the rarest and the most important thing. And I was right about it." He reached across and took her hand in his thumb moving over her knuckles in the habitual, unconscious way it did sometimes, and they looked at the stars together. "We have made something good," he said. "We have," she said. "We really have." The years moved forward as years do on a working ranch, each one accumulating experience and small changes, and the incremental architecture of a life that has its roots down deep. The railroad came fully to Caldwell in 1882 and changed the character of the town further. More permanent businesses, more families, a second church, a proper school that opened in the spring of 1883, and to which Edna had contributed not insignificantly in the 3 years of planning and fundraising. She had been elected to the school committee the previous winter, which surprised approximately nobody except herself. James started school in 1884, walking into the new schoolhouse with the alert, confident bearing of a child who has grown up in a house full of books and conversation, and has never been made to feel that his questions were inconvenient. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Alderton, who had come from Ohio with a proper teaching certificate and a formidable knowledge of mathematics, told Edna at the end of the first month that James was the most prepared student she had encountered in her first year of teaching, and that she expected great things from him, and also that he asked more questions than all the other students combined, which she said as a compliment, but with a slight cast to her eyes that suggested it was not always. "Yes," Edna said, "that's about right." Richard's correspondence with Helen reached its natural conclusion when Helen accepted his proposal and came to Caldwell in the fall of 1883, and they were married in the same church where Edna and Cornelius had been married, in a ceremony that was smaller and quieter, and that had its own particular sweetness. Edna stood up with Richard and Cornelius stood as his witness, and the whole Rocking D family came to the church, including Tom Briggs, who cried, which he denied afterward with an energy that convinced no one. Helen was a steady, gentle woman with a great capacity for work and a warmth that opened toward people slowly but completely, and she fit into the fabric of the Rocking D with an ease that felt, within a year, like she had always been there. She and Edna were not the same kind of person. Helen was quieter, more patient, less inclined to argue, but they understood each other and had between them the particular friendship of women who have navigated hard things and recognized the marks. Helen and Richard built their own house on the eastern edge of the property, on the land Cornelius had acquired in 1879, a two-room house that they added to as years went on, and Richard became a proper part of the ranch operation, eventually taking on management of the eastern herd, which he did with a capability that still occasionally surprised Edna because it was so different from the lost young man who had arrived at her porch with his hat in both hands. People changed, given the chance. She believed that she had seen it. Pete Albrecht retired from ranch work in 1884 when his knee, which had been bothering him for years and which he had never once complained about, finally decided it was finished with sustained physical labor. He moved to town and took a position at the feed store, which suited him excellently. The Rocking D gave him a farewell supper that lasted 4 hours and ended with Tom Briggs and Cornelius and Richard singing something in approximate harmony that was enthusiastic if not technically proficient, and Pete sat at the head of the table looking like the most contented man in the county, which he probably was. The ranch hired new hands, as ranches do, and the character of the place absorbed them as the Rocking D absorbed everything, with the particular culture of a household that was decent and serious and hard-working, and that treated people as people, which was not something every ranch could claim, and which meant that the Rocking D rarely had trouble keeping good workers. In 1885, on a Sunday afternoon in October that was warm and golden in the way that only October afternoons can be, Edna sat on the front porch of the Rocking D and looked at the scene in front of her with the deliberate attention she gave to things she wanted to remember completely. James, who was 5, was running across the yard with a stick, explaining something to himself at volume. Margaret, who was 3, was sitting in the dirt near the garden fence with a solemn expression and a collection of small rocks that she was apparently organizing according to a system that made complete sense to her and would presumably become clear to everyone else eventually. Richard and Helen were visible over by the east barn, walking together with the unhurried ease of people who have learned that being in the same direction is its own kind of happiness. Tom Briggs was in the corral working with a young horse, patient and methodical, talking to the animal in the low, steady voice he used. The cottonwoods were full color, yellow-gold in the late afternoon light, and the grass beyond them was dry and warm, and the sky above everything was that particular shade of Kansas October blue that seemed to go on forever in every direction. She heard Cornelius's step behind her. She knew his step the way you know the rhythms of a place you have lived in long enough, and he came and sat on the bench beside her with a cup of coffee for each of them and looked at the same scene she was looking at. "Full house," he said. "It is," she said. They sat together in the warm October light, and James ran, and Margaret sorted her stones with great seriousness, and the cottonwoods shone, and the ranch stretched out around them in all directions, alive and real and built of everything they had put into it. The work and the years and the arguments and the honesty and the love that had grown from a quiet kitchen table in the spring of 1878 into something neither of them would have dared predict. Cornelius put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into it, and he pressed his lips to her temple with the unhurried tenderness of a man who is not performing anything and never has. "Tell me something," he said, the way he sometimes started a conversation that was going to matter. "Tell you what," she said. "Tell me what you thought of me," he said, "that first afternoon when you got off the stage." She was quiet for a moment, remembering the dry wind, the long main street, the man coming toward her with his hat in his hand and those direct brown eyes. "I thought you were honest," she said, "and I thought you were going to be either very easy or very difficult to work for. And I thought you were better looking than I expected, which I was not going to mention." He laughed, a real full laugh which she had worked hard to earn in the early months and now heard regularly and never tired of. "When did you decide which one it was?" he said. "Easy or difficult?" "About 3 days in," she said. "Easy in all the important ways." "And the unimportant ones," he said with the dry humor she loved. "Extremely challenging," she said. "Relentlessly so." He pulled her closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched their children and their life in the afternoon light. The ranch around them steady and full and true, built from the ground up by two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and kept choosing each other every day since. James ran over suddenly, breathless and bright-eyed, and threw himself against his father's knee. "Papa, I need your help with something," he announced. "What kind of something?" Cornelius said. "A very important kind," James said, with the gravity that small children deploy for the things that are, in fact, very important to them. "All right," Cornelius said, and stood up and gave Edna a look over the boy's head that was full of warmth and amusement and love and every other good thing. "I'll be back." "I'll be here," she said. And she was, and he came back, and the evening came down over the rocking D in gold and blue, and the stars came out above the Kansas grass, one by one, until the sky was full of them, and the lights in the house came on, warm and steady, and the whole wide country held them safely in its enormous, indifferent hands, and they made it their own. Years later, when James was grown and had come back from 2 years at a college in the East full of ideas, and a need to explain them to everyone, and Margaret was 13 and interested in horses and mathematics with equal intensity, and Richard and Helen's 2 boys were regular fixtures at the Rocking D's Sunday dinners, and Tom Briggs had married a widow from the next county over and was insufferably happy about it. And the house had been added to 3 more times and had a proper library now at Edna's insistence years later, when things were settled and full and completely, irreversibly themselves. Edna would sometimes stand in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was up, with her first cup of coffee and the quiet of the sleeping house around her, and think about the stagecoach and the carpetbag and the derringer and the long road from Wichita. She would think about the woman she had been then, capable and alone and stubbornly hopeful about a future she could not quite see, and she would feel for her a great deal of tenderness and also a desire to tell her, "Hold on. It is coming. Something honest is coming, and it will be better than what you have the vocabulary for yet. Hold on." And then Cornelius would come down the stairs in the particular unhurried way he had, and come into the kitchen, and she would hand him his coffee, and he would look at her with those steady, honest eyes that had looked at her across 30 years of mornings, and she would know what she had always known since the second month, probably. that she had gotten off that stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and she had walked straight into the best thing that would ever happen to her. And she had known enough and been brave enough and been herself enough to keep walking toward it. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas morning was coming up gold and enormous, and the ranch was waking, and the horses were moving in the corral, and somewhere one of the grandchildren who was staying this week was making noise upstairs, and the cottonwoods were pale and still in the early light, and the grass went on in every direction as far as you could see, full of whatever future was still to come, open and waiting and wide.